Hi, this is Amy Henry from CNR Research. Thank you for attending our webinar today, Almost Famous, What Growing Up in a Performance Culture Means for Today's Youth. It's nice to see some of our YouthBeat clients and many of our CNR clients on the line, and some friends of, and hopefully people who have interest in this topic at least, and maybe interest in getting to know us a little bit better. So welcome to everybody. This is actually an abbreviated version of what we presented at Kid Power at that conference in Orlando about a month ago. So as we said then, this deck and even the deck that we presented at the conference are really just scratching the surface of our thinking on this topic of performance culture in youth today. So please reach out to us if you're really interested in hearing more. There's a lot more thinking that is behind this, and we are going to stick to the hour time frame that we promised today on the invite to the webinar, and we're hoping to leave some time for questions. So we've squeezed in everything we can. Hopefully we at least spark your interest, if not answer every question. That said, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type them in, and we'll either address them as they come up, if we can, and if not, we'll address them at the end. So I'm going to jump right in because we do have a lot to cover. First, I'll just give you a little bit of background on us and the study that you'll see. So we'll provide some evidence for this claim that we're making, that performance is a really important part of youth culture today. It's in some ways defining it, it's reflective of it, and we'll give you a lot of numbers, some data and information, and hopefully some insight behind it that tells you how to make sense of that data. But a lot of what we'll talk about in terms of making sense of the data, it comes in the section what it means to them. We'll really talk to you about how they're making sense of performance culture, which may be a little bit different than you might expect. And finally, we'll end, as we always try and do, with some parting words to tell you what this might mean to you. Again, I'm thrilled that we have such a diverse audience on the line, so we clearly won't be able to speak to the specific needs of each of your categories, but we're always happy to follow up and have conversations about applying this to your business and particularly your research agendas. So I'm sure most of you on the phone have some familiarity with CNR Research. That's probably how you found us, but you may not know very much about our youth practice. CNR has expertise in a number of different consumer segments and categories, a broad range of methods and techniques that cover both qualitative and quantitative, traditional, innovative, and non-traditional. But of course, we do have a solid history in the youth space, and we have real experts in-house who are focused on customizing methods and thinking about, in the way we all know we need to do when we're engaging youth in research, thinking about not just your research questions, but how we interpret them through the lens of what kids, tweens, and teens are like, what preschoolers are like, and what parents think and what they're like. Even if you don't know CNR, you may have encountered some of our brands along the way, and some of the brands that are most critical to understanding our youth practice are Kids Eyes and Teens Eyes, our proprietary CUPPA compliant online panels of respondents, which were among the first in the industry in terms of CUPPA compliance, and Parent Speak, which is our online community of both moms and dads that allows you to and allows us to work with our clients in an efficient way with an effective sample, a great sample, and we utilize those panels in YouthBeat, which is our syndicated study and insight service. We cover in YouthBeat in our ongoing online survey, we talk to 6 to 18-year-olds, first grade through 12th graders, and their parents as much as we do youth. So it's really a youth and family study, not just limited to youth. And that's where, as you'll see, much of the data from today's presentation comes from. So as I mentioned here, we're going to tackle the task in this hour of speaking to a really broad age range. We're going to talk about kids, tweens, and teens in this presentation. Of course, performance culture has different, there are different aspects of it that are more salient based on age, and that's something that we can talk to you about later, and we'll mention it throughout the presentation where it's really critical. The data that you'll see in this deck comes from our January to December of 2011, so full year 2011 data set, unless we've noted otherwise. We also, as part of this, and as part of a lot of our presentations, we always want to balance what we're hearing from our youth and families in the data with what we're seeing in the real world. So especially when it comes to performance culture, we really needed to do a cultural audit of where performance was starting to emerge in youth culture. We also did a literature review. I'm not sure if all of this is beach reading. I know the summer is coming up, but if you are interested in this topic and you'd like to have a really wonky conversation about performance theory, we're up for it. But we can also recommend some great literature if it's something that you're interested in hearing more about. And finally, we had the luxury for this project of doing some custom qualitative research with kids from the younger end of the spectrum, our kids and tweens, 8 to 14-year-olds. We did in-home ethnographies and monitor online communities with them. That was done through our qualitative group and led up by Mary McElrath, who many of you might know if you've done any youth and family qualitative research with CNR. So performance in youth culture. So, as I mentioned in our methodology, the first thing we did was we looked at, well, what does performance culture really mean? And there's a whole there's a whole kind of field of study on performance and on performance theory. And most of what we saw in the literature said something that actually looked a little familiar to us. It sounded like some of the things that we used to hear about kind of play theory, that performances are typically on a stage. They're in a set-aside place. They have a time limit. They are not supposed to produce anything except for an experience. So if there's a product that comes out of it, it's no longer a performance. And these were kind of interesting ideas to play around with, but the general consensus about performance in all of these theoretical works was that performance is a moment in time, it's a separation from the real world. And actually, if we know anything about this cohort, we know that performance is not a separate task. It is something that both bubbles up in almost every aspect of their life, whether it's in their school, in their classroom in terms of standardized testing and the emphasis placed on that, whether it's on the playing field where we know that the pressure to be an elite athlete kicks in at younger and younger ages. But what we also saw was that there were numerous places and ways in which performance was being redefined by youth, that performance isn't something that's just special, but it's also something that's happening on a daily, on a moment-by-moment basis, facilitated by entertainment, media, and technology that surrounds them. Now, again, we see performance culture as extending and having kind of tentacles that reach in all aspects of this cohort's daily life. But we're going to focus on the media and entertainment piece of it a little bit today. If you're interested, I know we have some people on the line who might be interested in the sports side of things or in school performance, and we do have data on some of those things, and we're happy to share. But let's look at this. So first, most of you know that it would be quite likely, if you know a kid, tween, or a teen, that they are a fan or a viewer of at least one talent TV shows. This is a category, over 60% of all of these groups, we see this little spike among the teens, and that's something that we'll kind of see throughout as we talk about these issues of performance, which, of course, in terms of developmental stage, is really meaningful to them at this point. It's the first time that they're really emerging into that social space in a new way, and they're starting to be concerned with identity and how they position themselves, even if they haven't started to do the tough work that happens in the teen years. But we see that it can be found on TV. It's something that if there is a not so outdated notion of appointment viewing for this audience who is has been raised and groomed to expect everything on demand, the shows that they would be making appointments to see would be these kinds of shows. And just to give you some perspective, there are a lot out there, and we have data on a lot of these shows, but these are the ones that not surprisingly rose to the top. Things like American Idol, which certainly courts and speaks directly to the youth cohort. And even things like Dancing with the Stars, where we see younger and younger stars from Disney, stars from Nickelodeon making appearances. They're starting to build in terms of audience appeal. but we see American Idol is still kind of defining this category for them. And interestingly, this is, and we've heard this over and over again, and we've actually been hearing this for years, for when American Idol first came on the airwaves, and there was as much controversy as applause for this show, especially Simon Cowell, who we'll talk about in a little bit. But as much as American Idol, there's some kind of contested notions about whether it's good for our youth or whether it's good for kids or what kinds of messages it's sending. We'll talk a little bit about that. It's not surprising to us that in the data we still continue to see that among all three age groups, American Idol is the show most likely to be co-viewed with parents. And we know that for this cohort, co-viewing isn't something that they do out of obligation, but actually co-viewing is something that kids and tweens and teens kind of willingly participate in with parents if the show is, certainly American Idol is a show that is right for that. We also interestingly see iCarly at number 3, a show that really all brings parents and kids together. You know that moms really like the humor on iCarly, some dads do as well. They watch that in great numbers with their kids. But we also know that obviously with iCarly, iCarly has her own show within her show, her own web show within the show, and that's not something that's really lost on this generation. Of course, when we look at their top websites, we see stages, and we'll talk about this in a bit, but we see things like Facebook and YouTube, which are about performance in not so subtle ways. So certainly when you're on a social networking site, and this is aggregate data, this brings together kids, tweens, and teens. Certainly some of these behaviors increase with age, but many of these behaviors tend to peak in those tween years. When they're first getting on social networks, they're kind of all in. This data, though, does also show what they have done, and you can see that the activities that most youth are likely to have done on social networking sites, almost all of them revolve around positioning yourself, showing how you want to be perceived, manipulating how you're perceived, or aligning yourself with properties or people who make you look and feel a certain way. And we think this is part of how performance is being shaped in the minds of this generation as well. Like a brand or product might be something that is of interest. You know, I will say in terms of this data, most youth on social networking sites, as this data shows, have liked a brand or product in the past. This isn't something that they're doing maybe even as frequently as adults are doing. So on one hand, if you're a brand who happens to be liked by a kid, tween, or teen, it is no small feat. On the other hand, if you're using that as a gauge of whether or not your brand is resonating with this youth, it may not actually be as useful of a measure as it might seem. We know that in order to perform, you need to have an audience, and certainly youth in all three of these age groups have big audiences when they're on social networking sites. This is just the average number of friends for each of these groups in the last year. We know that every year these increase just a little bit with these age groups. And, you know, it wouldn't be a Youth Beat presentation if we didn't bring up Justin Bieber, for those of you who have been on before. But certainly it didn't surprise us as we kind of make this case for performance culture being something that is on the minds and in the hearts of this generation. You know, it's no surprise to us that the famous person who they'd most like to hang out with is Justin Bieber. And actually, I will say, you might think this is just among girls, but this is actually an aggregate list for kids, tweens, and teens. Now, of course, teens have a tougher time agreeing on one person that they'd like to hang out with. So whereas kids and tweens seem to flock around a few famous people, they're certainly driving this data. But Justin Bieber, who is not only a star in this generation, but he is a star very much of this generation in the sense that, you know, in his biopic, his biopic, Never Say Never, certainly his origination story, the idea that he was discovered on YouTube, that he was just a regular kid, this can happen to everybody. It's part of the mythology and the lore of Justin Bieber, and his people have certainly nurtured that image and not run away from it. So it's not surprising he is both someone who they see as very kind of produced and polished, but also somebody who is like them because of this story and that they would want to hang out with. Also his girlfriend, not so much Barack Obama, but you know, he's just right behind Miley Cyrus, so he's probably not that offended. We also know that performance for this age group, and part of the evidence that we know performance is on the minds of and is shaping the way they see themselves, is something that youth might not even be completely aware of. That cameras surround them probably more than in any other generation. And these are just, some of these statistics are higher than others, but you can see that all the different places, even that just pop up in our survey, that we have found ourselves compelled to track in terms of having a video recording feature on devices. Almost every device around them that they honor in their homes, whether they're theirs or their parents, have a way to record and capture the moment. That's not always about performance, but it does create the sense that there is always a chance to perform, and there's always a sense that someone might be watching, and we'll talk about that a little more when we talk about how they make meaning of performance. If we're looking for evidence that something has pervaded youth culture, we always think that looking at the way they play is a really important place to start looking. And obviously, performance of all different types have come into play, whether it's with Dance Dance Revolution or Guitar Hero, or I personally love this. We have this in my house for my 4-year-old, a microphone that not only lets you perform, but actually has a pedal that lets you give yourself applause. So if that's not a sign of this generation, I'm not sure what is. We also see even apps, that allow them to manipulate their appearance. This is, some of the Photo Booth is one of the more popular apps among all three of these age groups, and it's not surprising. It is about performance. It is about letting you post, not only manipulate, but also post and share an image of yourself that is something that you're playing with, both kind of psychologically as well as literally. And of course, we could look at toys like this one that is hopefully popping up on your screen right now, the paparazzi playset. And this idea of kind of performance and being watched, and it is certainly part of their culture as well. But we could argue that those are more adult toys, that those are things meant to be kind of novelty items. But actually, it would be very hard to argue that a product like paparazzi was made for anybody but kids. And certainly the kids who are using it aren't thinking of this or consuming it in a tongue-in-cheek way, the way an adult might who has a paparazzi playset. So hopefully it's clear that performance and being on stage and being on display is certainly a part of the way this cohort lives now. But we wanted to ask ourselves, what does it really mean to youth themselves, and what does it tell us about ways to better connect with them? So what it means to them. So, it's clear to us that and this should almost be in quotes, this idea of a new script, that we mean script, not just a script for how they might perform something, but script in the more philosophical sense of how they kind of script their lives and what becomes important to them, what models they follow, what systems they adopt. And we see that with all of this performance culture, it certainly seems clear to us that there is a new script for this generation in terms of fame, in terms of success, in terms of performance, in terms of identity. All of these things are kind of confounded in this notion of performance. So first we see, we'll go through each of these individually, but everyone's a star, all the world's a stage, and of course along with that, everyone's a critic. For this generation, part of the script is system savvy, is knowing how fame and performance work, and finally, how being famous means making good. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these. So first, I mentioned that we had the luxury of talking to some kids and tweens on online discussion boards, and we also were able to go in home and visit some of them. And what we asked all of our respondents to do was create a video for an audition for something that they would be really good at. And what we heard, which seems really endemic of the way that this generation thinks about performance, is that all kinds of performances are in bounds. All kinds of skills are in bounds, and everyone is a star in their own way. And we heard this from really different types of kids, from different places, different ages, different genders, but we often heard the same script over and over again, whether they were talking about soccer, as that little girl is on the top, or about being on Monster High, which this little girl was on the bottom. the thing that's really interesting about this to us, and we do have this, we can't play it on the webinar, but if you are interested in hearing more, it's always useful to hear the voices of these kids as they talk about it. But in each segment, they really emphasized what was unique and special about them. And it was that this had become part of the script. Not only was it about finding something and expecting that they had something unique to offer, that they were a star for being them, but also when you look at the Monster High doll at the bottom, this was, they all had a gimmick. They all had props. They all had ways of showing how they could stand out. So not only is this about knowing that there's something special about them, but it's also about knowing how to market that special property. Some of the videos almost look like they were the packages from some of these talent shows, that they could have been the audition tapes, but they each had a way of bringing out that special thing about themselves in a unique and interesting way. We are from this generation. It's sometimes important to calibrate how we think about what they're viewing with how they see themselves. The kids, tweens, and that we talk to, especially on the younger end of things, if they were watching all of these shows or any mix of these shows, these reality shows, it wasn't that they necessarily saw them as a reflection of themselves. Sometimes, quite the opposite. Not too many kids and tweens really identified with what was going on down the Jersey Shore, and even the teens, most of them didn't identify with that as a reflection, as a mirror of themselves. But what they do understand is that even if they don't like the way that the people on these shows always handle their fame or always have arrived at their fame, they do recognize that there is something marketable about me. And this idea that my identity is something that is special, can be packaged, and can be shown and displayed is something that is very much on their minds, even if they're not that kind of person, even if they're not the kind of kid who creates a YouTube video of themselves. This is a concept that they're very aware of, and it means that these lines that we sometimes draw as adults and as marketers about authenticity, they're a little bit blurrier for this generation than they may have been in the past. It's not surprising, based on, I think, all the evidence that we showed in that first section, that for this generation, all the world really a stage. This is the generation where private spaces and public stages have really blurred. And we often blame this as adults on, kids getting on Facebook early and not knowing the proper etiquette. But this is a generation whose parents have put them up on baby blogs. It's a generation whose parents are on Facebook sharing pictures of kids. So these lines about public and private have really become blurry in the minds of kids. We think one implication, and we'll talk about this at the end, but we do think one implication of this is kids in this generation can sometimes feel always on, even if they sometimes seem completely unaware that they're on display. When they've posted something private on Facebook, and as a parent, if you see that, if they have spoken in too familiar of a way to the Twitter sphere, we sometimes think that they don't realize that they're on stage, but certainly they do, and they need a backstage as much as adults do. That's something that this generation is probably struggling with in terms of stress in the upcoming years. Now, in terms of YouTube, we see that over and over and over again, we heard that the stage of choice for this generation was YouTube. And interesting about this and these quotes from youth is that the whole notion of how to perform has really changed with this generation, that it's no longer that you earn your way to Carnegie Hall, or you earn your way to be on stage, that you are the best, and then you are on stage. But what's very clear from this is the idea that you can put yourself there. You don't have to be perfect. You can put yourself on display and see if it catches on. So this is something that certainly shapes the way that generation sees opportunities and also sees the path to success, although we want to calibrate that a little bit, and we'll talk about that in a moment. We might think that this is something that is naivete on the part of kids and tweens, but certainly we see some evidence that this is not. We already talked about Justin Bieber, and we know that Nickelodeon is also featuring the Fred the Show, based on Lucas, I'm going to butcher his name, I always do, Cruikshank, who became famous as one of the most watched video makers on YouTube, now has a show on Nickelodeon. So the validation, you know, from being on Nickelodeon to kind of being out in the more casual, the self-generated world has now flipped, self-generated to Disney, to Nickelodeon, to highly validated sources of youth culture. So this flip has switched. If any of you have seen these videos, you almost can't watch this slide without having his voice in your head. And while we know it's the kind of humor that kids and tweens love, we're going to move on. So part of being on stage and that being part of the psyche of this generation of kids, tweens, and teens is also the notion, the really strong awareness that everyone is a critic, or everyone has the potential to be a critic. It's really fascinating when we look at the popularity of these shows and how kids and tweens and teens, but especially kids and tweens, now can talk about musicians that they like, talk about performances, and they're being, in a way, they're being taught some of the skills that we have been saying all along that kids should develop. Critical thinking skills, they have to distance their choices, they have to look to evidence to support why they like a dance, why they like a singer. And some of this is being fueled by the popularity of judges. I think it's no surprise that these judges have become the stars of the show in many ways. You know, we can ask and we can compare what is Simon Cowell really telling kids about how to critique, but you know, don't assume that they're also looking at someone like Simon Cowell and just assuming and taking full fold what he's saying as a model, but they're actually grappling with these styles of critiquing and these styles of evaluating and judging. This generation is a commenting generation, a critiquing generation, and for them, part of engaging in a show, part of their participation in the show that makes these shows so great for many of them are, even though it's smaller numbers who participate, participating means critiquing for these shows. You know, putting in your vote means, in a way, engaging in that critiquing. And we also see that for this generation, though, critiquing isn't about separating or alienating or confronting or conflicting, that it's really about creating community. So we also see that this kind of constant commentary criticism that is part of watching TV shows right now, and this is again for all age groups, this certainly gets a little bit higher among teens, but there is a little peak among older tweens, just in case you're looking at different age groups. But they are engaged in technology while they're watching TV to differing degrees. And for these audiences, we see that, you know, it's often about commenting and critiquing on the shows that they're seeing. But we do know that even though this kind of quick path may seem really exciting and inviting to youth, they are also learning these lessons that once you put yourself out there on a place like YouTube, there is backlash. And, you know, for their generation, nobody really embodied that more than Rebecca Black, who received lots of attention for her song Friday, so much so that she was receiving threats and being bullied online for the show. And that's a story, that's a tale, a cautionary tale, if you will, to this generation who sees that putting themselves out there on YouTube is a path to fame potentially, but they're also learning that there are critics when you do that. So they're not completely oblivious to that. We also see, on a really dark note, we've talked about this on our Youth Beat blog in much more depth, but we saw this trend. We don't know. We haven't heard it in our focus groups. We don't know how many girls are actually doing it, but any amount of girls doing this is, of course, quite disturbing. Teen girls asking the internet, posting videos of themselves on YouTube and saying, "Am I ugly?" and saying, one of the videos that is probably most heartbreaking and the one that's been played over and over again in relationship to this story, this little girl says, "I can take it, I can take it, I can take it." the criticism. Please tell me the truth. And so this is something, this idea that you need feedback is something that probably comes from all different places in the culture of this cohort, but certainly this idea of performance and criticism and being judged, it plays a role in it. The fourth aspect of the new script for today's youth is system savvy. And here we couldn't help but kind of insert ourselves a little bit in some debates that have been happening on this. I know this article on the left-hand side is has been passed around quite a lot in a lot of the kids' media. I know in a lot of our chat rooms and LinkedIn groups and things like that. It seems to have a life of its own, but it's about a study that was conducted in 2007. And it was published in the Cyber Psychology, which isn't one that I'm terribly familiar with, but it is a journal, an academic scholarly journal, and they asked kids where the number one thing they wanted was, and according to these researchers, the answer was fame. And there's a long discussion that kind of follows this of whether or not kids, tweens, and teens are losing sight of what's really important in life, whether they have a false sense of how fame is really earned and generated and developed. And I will say that, you know, we have found that not to be the case in our data. We don't often hear, in fact, we hear the most important thing in their lives is parents and families, and the things they worry about most tend to be getting good grades in school and things that would not be about fame. But certainly we don't deny that fame looks maybe more approachable than ever before for this generation. But on the other hand, we would say that what we've also seen plenty of evidence for, both in this research and in our kind of interactions with youth, that this generation is really cognizant of the way they're evaluated in the world. They're really savvy about self-presentation, and in a way, they operate under a notion that to be a celebrity does not mean to have earned your way to those stages as we talked about, but it means to that everyone has a chance to be a star, to be a celebrity. So we interpret this as something that's potentially realistic, not as naive as we might think. We asked our panelists on our online community how they get discovered, and we saw an interesting progression that was, this is one example of a 10-year-old girl telling us how she would become a famous cheerleader and what those steps would involve. And the first two, you know, cheering for college, cheering for the Dallas Cowboys, that might seem to be the pinnacle. But actually the pinnacle for this generation has one layer above it about being on America's Next Top Cheerleaders. So cheerleading for the Dallas Cowboys is fine. But really being on TV and being rewarded from those kinds of performance media is really where this generation sees success in terms of that. But what's also really interesting is even just looking at American Idol, the system that they're picking up on is not something that is, you know, they're not blinded by the idea that America decides or that their vote counts. That's clearly a compelling part of the backstory of American Idol. It's clearly part of the marketing for these kinds of shows that you decide. But as you can see, fewer kids participate by actually voting. They love the idea that they can vote. The idea that anybody could apply. Kids at this point know that the front of that line has a long line quite behind it. So they know that ultimately they might have a chance, but it's not going to be just based on their performance. It's going to be based on those judges who, you can see in the American Idol panelists, come from validated stars within the industry. What's different about American Idol, and what is really something that seems to be part of the story of all of these shows that we sometimes miss, is that kids get a very clear picture of the steps that it really takes to become famous. But first, by being judged and embraced by other people in the industry, especially producers. Kids know what a producer is today, and we heard kids in our recent Youth Beat qualitative saying that when they grew up, they would like to be a producer. That was not a career that we used to hear even 10, 12 years ago. We see they need to pay homage to the elders in the industry. They need to, they launch their first album, but they also need to go on tour. They can be part of the American Idol. These brands kind of come to life in other venues, and they're expected to be a part of that. And finally, they are mentored and coached by people. So even the most authentic of artists, the real kids who get this shot, kids are very aware and are almost perhaps intentionally reminded throughout these shows that there is an industry and there is a process, and it is not just about fame and moving on, that there are coaches, there's marketing, etc. So this generation, if anything, might be more aware of the steps involved in this kind of fame than in generations in the past. Finally, we see this in almost every aspect of youth culture that we look at, that for this generation, and we heard this again and again in our interviews, being famous means making good. That is part of the script of fame right now, even if we tend to see some young celebrities or celebrities that young people look up to, not necessarily living by this. We certainly see this as part of the script that they hope people who are famous will achieve. We heard this little boy, I wish you could see this video, but he says something that our kids said over and over again in this research: I kind of vote for the people that are humble. So for all this kind of star power diva, they're not attracted to the Sweet 16 divas. They're really attracted to that celebrity, that young celebrity on American Idol who says that what really makes them tick is, what they're really all about is giving back to their community or being good to their family, or they're really appreciative of this opportunity. So this kind of story, this backstory, is an important part. It's a way that, in a way, kids have been sensitized to this as being an important part of what a good celebrity does. And certainly we see, again, American Idol kind of reinforces this message with things like Idol Gives Back. Giving back has to be part of this performance territory, which kids very much absorb. They very much understand that. This is often in contrast to how kids who watch and consume this kind of show are often portrayed as only focused on fame. That's certainly not the case. That's not the message that they're taking away from these shows and other aspects of performance. So some implications. If everyone's a star, we think it's important that you as a brand, as an organization, as a content provider, emphasize that you understand what makes them unique. This is part of what this generation expects. They know that they're stars, even if they're supposed to be humble, but recognize that they still crave community, that being a star can be quite isolating. Being part of these groups, being an individual is great, but they still crave community, so don't forget that. If all the world's a stage, know that style matters as much as substance. In our earlier version of this presentation, we had a clip of a great ad from Microsoft that's actually been running globally. You may have seen it. It's a boy in front of a computer screen and a father in front of his computer screen. The father is working on a PowerPoint presentation. It looks pretty boring. He goes into the kitchen and he comes back, and his tween son is on his computer, and not only has he made the graphics look much bigger, bolder, prettier, more beautiful, but he's also put a soundtrack to it. And this, we think, is really says a lot about what this generation sees in terms of presentation, that style matters as much as substance to them. They know that they're on stage. They expect you to be on stage. As we mentioned before, help them find a backstage where they can truly be themselves. While it seems as though this generation might gravitate towards living their lives in a much more public way than any cohort before them, they still value and they need, even if they aren't aware of it, they need those private moments, those private spaces. See how your brand can help them associate with them or your organization. If everyone's a critic, don't forget to provide them the recognition they need. We still see, when we ask kids to show us what's important to them, we still see trophies over and over again, even though everybody gets a trophy, whether you've won or lost, whether you're the best player on the team or the second best player on the team. We know that this kind of recognition still very much matters. and expect that they'll want to provide you with feedback too. Don't resist letting kids, tweens, and teens comment, make suggestions and critique your brand. This will strengthen your relationship from them, not alienate you from them. If they have system savvy, if they understand how things work in a much more complicated way, let them see behind the scenes of your brand or organization. Just based on their viewing habits, they know that there is a behind the scenes to almost every kind of operation, and they appreciate understanding that. Don't dismiss their precociousness too. Help them indulge it. I know, it used to be that when we were in focus groups, we would see kids who had been through media training class. And we always knew that they had been through media awareness class, and suddenly they couldn't respond to an ad or to a program or to a brochure, but instead they would help you redesign it using some of the tricks of the trade that they were, in all reality, being told to avoid, but actually embracing. But this precociousness about wanting to know how the system works or wanting to know more about the behind the scenes, embrace it, treat it seriously, because this is how this group of consumers will probably grow up, and it will most likely be the way that they expect the world to operate in years to come. And finally, if being famous means making good, balance your brand's confidence with humility and encourage youth to do the same with their personal brand, and especially for those of you who have direct contact with you through organizations or through segments of your offering. We think this is something that kids still appreciate. They sometimes need to know. They're sometimes seeking out ways, strategies for balancing out, showing off all the great talents and assets they have with being a humble a person who is a giver as much as a receiver. And we think, as always, that it's a good idea for this generation to facilitate philanthropic involvement wherever you can. We know with teens, doing this in a really authentic way is important, but even with kids and tweens, getting them into these habits of giving back early is something that they'll see recognized in the culture around them. So in this way, you're not bucking what they want or what they see or what's aspirational to them, but you're actually fitting within it. So that's all we have. I'm not sure if we have any questions from the crowd, but if you'd like to send them in now, if you already have, I'm sure they are on their way to me. Some of the questions that came up the last time we did this were about specific shows and the power of specific shows and what they're doing to foster it. And we would say that most of the shows that are most compelling to youth are giving them those ways to participate, are helping them feel like they have a say in the vote, but are also, again, showing them some of those behind the scenes pieces that are making the production of a star very transparent. I can also talk a little bit, actually, some of the questions we received the last time we presented this were about sports. And we do have lots of data on sport participation. We know that more than ever when we talk to kids, tweens, and teens, and especially in speaking with their parents, that the pressure at a younger age to perform and to, for example, 10-year-olds being told that they need to choose their sport, choose one sport, that they can no longer participate on a school team and a club team. We see this really pronounced in soccer. We certainly see kids feeling the effects of this. It means that for our older tweens and certainly for teens, that more of them drop out of organized activities, which include exercise. So in the midst of this childhood obesity epidemic, perhaps a cause, but also one of the real opportunities is to provide more organized ways, more ways to have fun with friends, to experience the positive benefits of sports, of being on a team, and getting exercise at the same time. We do know, though, that for kids, tweens, and teens, it's still very small percentages based on our YouthBeat data that self-identify as being on truly elite teams. So that also tells us that this being an elite athlete is more a part of the kind of zeitgeist for this age group, but it's not necessarily something that more and more kids, as many kids as you might think, are participating in. those who do, it's very intense. It's probably more intense than ever at a younger age, but it's not all kids, certainly, and there's still plenty of kids, especially in our kid age group, which we define as 6 to 10, and in our tween age group that are trying to play, trying to stay on organized sports just for fun. I do have a question here. Do you see a big difference between younger kids and tweens or tweens and teens around fame? Are perceptions or expectations different? It's a great question. It's one that we see, I think that in many ways, as we mentioned, tweens, this kind of fame game and this whole idea of performance culture really peaks in the tween years. We define tweens a little bit older, but I would say even those 10 and 11-year-olds, that kind of those early tweens in our definition and the late kids are really embracing this idea. They're very aware that performance is something that they are kind of accountable for in the way that teens start to recognize that all eyes are on me. Certainly tweens, we think even younger and younger, are getting that sense that all eyes are on me. For kids, a lot of it is still about fun. They don't experience the negative or the anxiety-causing aspects of fame or of performance or of being on stage in the same way as those older tweens do. For older tweens, in some ways, it's so much more salient because it's exciting. There's risk involved. There's oftentimes easy risk, safe risk involved in these kinds of things. But there is risk, and it is that magic formula of a little bit of risk and an opportunity for something really great happening to you that makes it really exciting for tweens. For kids, we do see more and more interest in these talent shows, although many of them are on just a little bit past their bedtime. So we do see lower numbers participating and engaging in those shows, but we think that that's more about bedtime, although many are watching on demand. But they don't have quite the same kind of appointment viewing relationship to some of these shows as the slightly older kids do. I'll just add to that, we know that what it might seem like these kind of YouTube rises to fame could also invite some skepticism and cynicism among teens and tweens. But the older kids, the tweens and the teens that we talk to, tend to have a much more pragmatic perspective on this. They know that YouTube is a good way to get yourself out there. They understand how public relations works in many ways. They understand how putting themselves out there works. And so rather than scoffing at someone who might put themselves out there, they tend to either applaud or just think that that's the way things are. We hear cynicism often from parents in this regard, and fears that maybe kids are are rewarding the wrong things when it comes to fame, but not so much from kids. And as I mentioned again, we have lots of information and lots of insight on this topic related to kids, tweens, and teens, and we would love to share. Thanks everyone for attending. I think we're going to sign off, but please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or thoughts, or reach out to whoever you work with at CNR if you don't know us. We're happy to tell you more about this study or about YouthBeat. Thanks a lot.